Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this event. My name is Simonetta Moro. I am the president of the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts. And I'm very pleased to be hosting this Transatlantic Conversations, this other text between word and image. And this is a symposium that is part of a series of lectures, meetings, webinars that we have been organizing for now a couple of years together with our friends and partners at the School of the Arts, University of Pretoria, the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Pretoria, the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of the Witwatersrand. And I would particularly like to thank Meryl Williams, Liz Creel, Adam Levin, Benda Hofmeier, Diane Lukic, and Johan Thom, who is here with us today for organizing this event. So without any further ado, I would leave it to Johan to introduce our panelists and have a great webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simonetta. It's wonderful to be here with everyone today on this fine Friday. It seems only apt that I'm greeting everyone from an arts festival in South Africa, in the Klein Karoo, called the Klein Karoo National Arts Festival in Oudtshoorn. This for a transatlantic conversation, and it's really my pleasure to introduce today's speakers to you, with whom it seems I've shared at least one or two occasions in my life, and sometimes more than that. So first up, I should like to introduce the speakers. Sean O'Toole is a writer, editor, curator, and occasional literary pamphleteer based in Cape Town. He has published 2 books, edited 3 volumes of essays, and written extensively about art, photography, and architecture for various print and online media. His most recent books are the biography Irma Stern, African in Europe, European in Africa, 2021, and The Journey, New Positions in African Photography, 2020, a New York Times Notable Art Book of 2021. His recent curatorial projects include Photobook 2022 at A4 Arts Foundation and The Objects 2023 at Under Projects, both in Cape Town. I've known Sean as a prolific writer and a great thinker about South African art, and it's really our pleasure to welcome him to this series of talks. Secondly, Rael Jarrow-Sally is faculty in the history of art, design, and the visual culture at the Maryland Institute College of Art. Founding creative director of the Space for Creative Black Imagination Incorporated, producer of Making Art History Now, a collaboration between Yale University and La Biennale de Venezia, and curator of Looking Rights, Johns Hopkins University, supported by the Mellon Foundation. Sally is an internationally recognized advisor, creative, and scholar who makes conceptual art, teaches martial arts, leads yoga sessions, and most importantly, in my estimation, feeds a dog called Biko, waters glorious plants, and is Macy's grandson. Please see more at raelsallystudio.com. The moderator, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Anthea Boyce. She's an independent researcher, curator, and writer living in South Africa. Her academic work has focused on the intersections of philosophy, art, and literature, and her current curatorial undertaking is a retrospective exhibition of the South African, France-based performance artist Stephen Cohen, Iziko South African National Gallery, forthcoming December 2025. We are all very much looking forward to this. She's interested in collective fabulation, North-South relations, ethics, improvisation, and failure. It is my wonderful pleasure to introduce these 3 wonderful individuals to you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Over to you. Thank you, Anthea.
Thank you, Johan, for that lovely introduction. I would like to provide some partial context for the presentations and discussions to follow by making a few digressive remarks about a 1973 essay by Roland Barthes. The essay in question, which is cited in the announcement text for the event, which you will have seen, is called The Third Meaning, Notes on Some of Eisenstein's Stills. And it was published in the January 1973 edition of Artforum magazine. Now, at that time, the magazine's editor-in-chief was an Englishman named John Copland. Incidentally, Copland's had spent his childhood between Johannesburg and Cape Town before eventually settling in London. He was deployed in the Second World War and stationed in East Africa, and on his return to civilian life in 1945, he became an artist. After a move to the US in 1960, Copland's entered the West Coast art world and became involved in the founding of Artforum. He wrote regularly for the magazine and ultimately became editor-in-chief, as announced in 1972. At some point along this trajectory, he felt he had to choose between image and text. He gave up being a painter to focus on art criticism. Again, incidentally, years later, he quit writing and curating and became an artist once more at the age of 62. That's not the whole picture, but it is at least part of it. But to come back briefly to Artforum, Copland's years of involvement with the magazine were precisely the years of its first major factionalization. The warring factions in this case were, on the one hand, founding editor Phil Leider's old-school formalist Greenbergian cohort, and on the other hand, Max Kozloff and Copland's, who were interested in post-minimalism, conceptual art, and critical theory. Copland's and Kozloff won out for a while at least, but the die was cast, so to speak, and this rupture had a lasting impact on the incursion of European critical theory, and particularly post-structuralist theory, into American art criticism. So in this light, Barth's presence in the magazine in 1973 was an important win for Team Copland's and Kozloff. Barth's best-known essay, The Death of the Author, was first published in English in 1967 and only anthologized in 1977 in the essay collection Image, Music, Text. And the intervening years were some of his most productive. So Artforum's publishing was really in step, in real time, with emerging discourse around the relationship between image and text. With that background in mind, I have one or two comments on the essay itself, which will hopefully open things up for our two presenters. The third meaning is an analysis of sorts of Sergei Eisenstein's two-part Soviet epic film, Ivan the Terrible, the first part of which was released in 1945. Except that Barthes doesn't actually engage with the film itself, only with a handful of stills from it. In fact, Barthes quickly dispels any expectation from the reader that he is about to say something important about the film itself, writing in the very first sentence, admittedly a long and parenthetical sentence, "It doesn't really matter whether or not I recall the story's details exactly." To my mind, this is really the key to the whole essay. The third meaning to which Barthes refers in the essay's title is something he calls the obtuse meaning that arises from a text, where text is conceived of broadly, and in this case, the text is Eisenstein's film stills. Unlike informational meaning or symbolic meaning, both of which are readily legible in an image, obtuse meaning evades and exceeds the Saussurean dyad of signifier and signified. And the reader is the interface that brings this excess. In this respect, reading or looking is in its own way writerly, which is the central idea in The Death of the Author. Let's look at what exactly or what inexactly Barthes has to say about obtuse meaning. Obtuse meaning vanishes, he writes. It has something to do with disguise, and it sustains a certain emotion. An obtuse reading is a reading that remains suspended between the image and its description, between definition and approximation. And finally, obtuse meaning is discontinuous, indifferent to the story. What Barthes seems to say as well, though, is that it's not just a language game or a question of aesthetics, or rather perhaps that this particular question of aesthetics actually has implication for our lived lives or how we interpret our lived lives. Barthes writes, that is the whole point. The supplementary signifies indifference or freedom of position with respect to the narrative, permits us to locate Eisenstein's historical, political, and theoretical achievements quite precisely. He goes on to say that this stature of the narrative is necessary in order to be understood in a society which, unable to resolve the contradictions of a history without a long political process, derives help provisionally from mythic narrative solutions. This brings me in closing back to the scene of John Copland's childhood, which is also a place of relevance to several of us here. South Africa. The contexts are very different, but both Sean and Rael interface with the art world of South Africa, and I can't resist the temptation to suggest that the work each has done in mediating art from this context has also indirectly been a reflection on how narrative and mythic solutions have been deployed in an attempt to resolve the contradictions of history. So with these murmurings in the background, and even discarding them in Barth's words like a launching rocket, I think it's now for us to hand over to Rael and Sean. So we'll begin with Sean, and just a note to the audience, we're happy to take questions as we go. Just a note, please use the Q&A function in the webinar. There's a little box that says Q&A, and don't use the chat functionality. Okay, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Anthea. Thanks to both Simonetta and Johan for the invitation to speak. I feel like a bit of a charlatan here, which might cue into the subject of my talk, being about art criticism. I've titled my talk, The Never-Ending Death of Art Criticism. I suppose there's a caveat to that, in that when art critics speak and have nothing to say, they talk about what they do and frame it as a kind of obituary of what they do. I hope I can reach a little bit beyond that. I'm mostly going to read. I prepared a talk that's about a presentation that's about 20 minutes. And I think there's no images to accompany. It's really about the literary practice. This will not delve into autobiography, so I'll spare you that, even though you look at me. But I will begin autobiographically. So I am an art critic, and as such, every so often, I will do a health check to see what condition my condition is in. The self-motivated inquiry has its merits, in part because it is self-reflexive. What am I doing? But it is also structural, what's happening in the field. The evolving nature of the art field frequently prompts me to ask myself if I'm indeed still an art critic. I think the key word here, though, is evolving. Criticism, like the mutable cultural expression it attends to, is changeable, always in flux. Nothing is certain. Everything is permitted. The Spanish art historian Juan Minguat neatly summarized the optimism implicit in this precarious situation when he said last year, "Art criticism is not dead, but Diderot is." Sontag and Robert Hughes are dead too, as is Maurice Berger and Esme Berman. But art criticism, by which I mean simply the patient, unheroic practice of translating an encounter with an art object or image into words that imply or express judgment. That thing, that activity, that unheroic practice persists. This is, of course, an optimistic version of things. Health checks, such as the one I'm venturing here, are common amongst critics to the extent that they've become rhetorical and their conclusions scripted. One common conclusion is that criticism is kaput. It is a claim that has been rehearsed for decades, if not centuries, despite the continued production of vibrant and often engaged criticism. In this short century alone, writers like Ronan MacDonald, James Elkins, the former New York Times film critic A.O. Scott, more recently Benjamin Buchloh, have all, in very different ways, declared that cultural criticism is in decline, or as Buchloh states in his book Exit Interview from 2024, criticism is obsolete. This paradox of continuity amidst decay, of criticism's endurance, is the subject of my talk today. What follows condenses insights that I gleaned during my shambolic research towards an incomplete doctorate. You could take them as an attempt to revivify my failure, to understand where I fit in a dynamic, ever-changing economy of comment and opinion on art. Today, though, I particularly want to tackle one question, and that question is, Why does the narrative of criticism's demise endure, even as the practice ambiguously persists? 3 interlinked themes might steer us to an answer, and my talk is framed around them. The first is the ontological instability of criticism. The second deals with its decline as a journalistic form. And the third, which is related, is the rise of digital punditry. So onto the first theme, ontological instability, or, as I subtitled this section, who the hell is Diderot? Art criticism operates under an ontological instability that has long haunted cultural criticism at large. I mean, that's my basic point. What, after all, constitutes criticism? Is it evaluative judgment of aesthetic objects? Is it a form of historical or theoretical discourse? Is it a creative literary practice? Anthea gestured to the schisms that happened at Artforum. And the point is that the 20th century breakdown of disciplinary boundaries led to a fracturing of criticism into diverse methodologies and modes of address, ranging from philosophically inflected theoretical writing to lapidary journalism and narrative-driven essayism, to now, in 2025, social media hot takes. This ambiguity as to what criticism is has contributed to a recurring sense of crisis. It's a crisis around the function and definition of criticism. I like to believe, and this stems from my doctoral research, that there's a social and historical context to this crisis. Terry Eagleton, the English literary critic, in his book, The Function of Criticism, which was published in 1984, argues that the roots of a Western-style cultural criticism, and I quote here, are closely linked to the rise of the liberal bourgeois public sphere in the early 18th century, end quote. Criticism, which Eagleton provocatively characterized as a juridical technology, I like that phrase, a juridical technology. Criticism initially embodied a Republican ideal, playing a crucial role in public discourse and democratic engagement. For Eagleton, criticism is an expression of what he calls historical emancipation. Its function, in other words, I argue, is existential. It enables what Buchloh very recently called, and I quote, an authentic collective access to vision, end quote. Now, in 2025, the uncertainty about what criticism is, its decoupling from republicanism, its dialectical expansion, or conversely, its critical devolution into populism, is heightened by shifts in authorship and authority. Is the critic a professional with institutional legitimacy, or is criticism a mode of collective discourse distributed across platforms? The very question of what art criticism is and who is entitled to speak within it remains unresolved, fueling the notion that it is always on the brink of obsolescence. Perhaps, maybe, this contingency, this precarity is fundamental to the practice. I want to invite a poet and early publisher of the poets Oswald Machali and Wally Serote, Lionel Abrams. He dwelled on this. I want to quote something at length that he wrote. I am, this is Lionel Abrams speaking, I am a critic without scholarship or theory, a reviewer without consistency or industry, an editor without professionalism, a publisher without organization or capital, and a teacher of creative writing without philosophy or method or depth of culture, end quote. To be a critic, in other words, involves the need to reconcile oneself with the preposition without, to be without. I mean, a simple question, who wants to work in such an economy? Many young critics that I've worked with as an editor over the years tend to retreat into the academy. their prose inevitably withers. And by that I mean an authenticity, an originality. Some instead pursue other hustles, like the great South African critic Ivor Powell, who jettisoned art criticism in favor of investigative journalism and later desk work at the state prosecutor. Ivor was long fascinated by symbolic expressions of power, but ultimately became ensnared in the machinations of actual brute power. He came undone. I spoke to him after this and asked him about his decision to quit criticism. This is Ivor. Back in the United States and Europe, it is, I think, perfectly possible there to carve out a career and a sense of purpose from the business of criticism and the assumption of the role of the critic. Here, in South Africa, he was referring to, frankly, I think it is absurd, end quote. In many ways, Ivor Powell was rehearsing an orthodoxy, a dogma. Every other year, a well-meaning critic will inform their audience about the unhealthy state of criticism, cultural criticism, art criticism. Anxiety panels prosper. Here's an example from a panel that was staged in New York in 2023. The invitation read, "The Enlightenment figure of the critic speaking from a perfectly detached perspective with transcendent authority is dead. The postmodern critic who foregrounds the construction of the systems they purport to critique seems ill-equipped to address the political realities of a fracturing society." There's not much to take issue there. Health checks, I want to return to that point that I made at the beginning. Health checks are important to the survival of anybody, be it an actual, corporeal, or an imagined social enterprise like criticism. But I want to argue, crying wolf by always diagnosing ill health, or worse, say imminent death, is another thing. This is simply trading in provocation and virality, which is an evergreen form of spectacle I'll return to a little later. I want to look a little bit at the phenomena of journalistic art criticism. Art criticism is not dead, but Peter Sheldal is. The New Yorker's longtime art critic, who passed in 2022, his death happened at a particular moment in traditional media. Art criticism has waned as a journalistic practice. It's not waned suddenly. It's been a slow death in some senses. In 2002, Columbia University's journalism school commissioned and published a report called The Visual Art Critic. And I just want to quote a small passage from there. "Full-time staffing is the strongest indicator of the importance of a given journalistic beat. Here, the facts speak for themselves. The majority of art critics work as part-timers," end quote. This is 2002. By 2017, the Columbia Journalism Review noted that culture critics generally at newspapers, and I quote, "were dying off faster than print journalism." This story has played out in South Africa with similar, perhaps even stronger force. The transition from print to digital certainly played a major role in the shift as advertising-based revenue models struggled to sustain traditional modes of writing. This has culminated in a weakening of art criticism's public-facing role as reviews or essays are displaced by listicles, aggregated rankings, profiles of high-value artists, previews of art fairs and biennales, and entertainment-orientated coverage. In this regard, I'm guiltier than most. I've produced versions of this perishable journalism. The contraction of traditional media has led to, and I'm maybe repeating myself, but it's worth repeating, has led to the disappearance of particular types of genres of writing about art that we associate with criticism, notably the essay and perhaps the long-form review. Editors, hoping to best the perpetual presentness of social media, now favor anticipatory previews, lifestyle content, and market-driven coverage linked to paid media partnerships. The outcome is an algorithmically optimized form of cultural journalism. The meaning of being an eclectic, which is how Lionel Abrams phrased his role as a cultural critic, has a totally different meaning in our techno-feudalist present, where the critic once held a clear, if marginal, cultural function in newspapers and periodicals. Today, their role is dispersed, their authority is diluted. They are compilers rather than beat-trained reporters. They tend to be slick conversationalists and gatherers of high-res JPEGs. This precarity, which is now less speculative than real, has and will continue to inflect what is written, where and when, as critics must navigate the demands of freelancing, social media visibility, and the shifting priorities of publications. More than ever, art criticism in the digital age is marked by a true amateurism, where enthusiasm is met by wage precarity, but also perhaps more fundamentally by a condition, and I'm gesturing here to Lionel Abrams, without scholarship or theory, without consistency or industry, without professionalism, without organization or capital. Which leads very neatly into the theme of digital punditry, or, if we want, art criticism, we could argue, is dead, but Jerry Gagosian is very much alive. The proliferation of digital forms of criticism, such as Twitter threads or X threads now, YouTube explainers, TikTok commentaries, and podcasts, has generated a more ephemeral and populist and hybridized critical landscape. These new modes, while vibrant and accessible, often collapse the distinction between criticism and punditry. On one level, it is an exciting time for art criticism. New techniques, such as aggregating, scrolling, browsing, sampling, skimming, and sharing have and will unavoidably produce new ways of narrating art. One could even argue that the rise of these perishable, rapid-fire forms of art criticism have made criticism more participatory, maybe even democratic, if you want to go that direction. But it is equally true that it has also made criticism more susceptible to hype, sensationalism, and the logic of platform capitalism. Online cultural commentators frequently operate as personalities, cultivating audiences through a mix of opinion, reaction, and performance, rather than through sustained analysis and argumentation. The shift away from a journalistic ethos of dispassion to a pundit-like mode has, I argue, and I believe this, implications for criticism's intellectual function going forward. And here I just want to jump briefly sideways to a book that was published in 1992, titled The Political Pundits by Dan Nemo and James Coombs. And they discuss how political punditry thrives on immediacy, rhetoric, performance, rather than investigative rigor. I'm sure the current US presidency, I don't need to explain any further. Political punditry valorizes the kind of entrepreneurial gusto that was satirized by Edgar Allan Poe in his 1840 short story about the schemer and hustler Peter Prophet. Art criticism is not dissimilar, now tends to operate like political punditry. It is a form of creative and intellectual grifting in which, to borrow from Nemo and Coombs, and I quote here, a priestly pundit is decidedly tied to the immediacy of the present, at least in the sense of voicing ideas derived from and pertaining to the current, and even fashionable problems, end quote. Today's digital art critics, using Instagram primarily, often traffic in provocation, virality, and spectacle, qualities that may shape discourse, but really deepen our appreciation of it. So where are we at? This is my concluding gamut. Art criticism is not dead, but maybe I am. The recurring lament over the death of criticism obscures a more complicated reality. Criticism has not disappeared. Rather, it has morphed, hybridized, and dispersed into new forms, some of which bear little resemblance to their historical predecessors. What is at stake, for those who believe that there is a social stake in criticism, is not simply the survival of criticism, but the ways in which it is practiced, circulated, and understood. Is it a democratic practice? If criticism has died, then it is only in the sense that it has continually reinvented itself. I think we should always balance optimism with a bleak view. Each transformation tends to provoke sometimes a nostalgic mourning for what was, or wasn't, or was supposed to be, or could still be. So the situation, to quote A.O. Scott in the 2010 piece, is miserable, and yet it is full of possibility. Scott wrote, "The world is always falling down. The news is always very sad. The time is always late, but the fruit is always ripe." End quote. To which I'd add, yes, but where are the pickers? Dead, downsized, deported? Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for that fascinating and quite entertaining presentation. I think that we should, I see Rails here. I think we should move straight on to his presentation. And just a reminder to those in the audience, please feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A box down below. After Rails' presentation, we'll go through some questions and open up the discussion a bit between the speakers and all of those gathered here. Thank you. Over to you, Rael.
Thank you. I want to make sure you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I do have some audio and some visual that I'd like to make available. It says I am screen sharing and you can see my application. I hope that's true.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm going to try to slideshow. Can you still see my application?
Perfect.
Fantastic. I want to say thank you to everyone, IDSVA and the University of Pretoria for inviting me to this conversation. Let's see if I can advance this. Right here. This was my introduction. I'm saying who I am. I'm Rael Jarosali. I believe that I've already been introduced. I'm talking and I don't think you can hear it, but what I'm saying is I'm introducing the space for creative Black imagination. And I am attempting to give thanks to the University of Pretoria School of the Arts, as well as the African Center for the Study of the United States. I've provisionally titled my lecture Looking After Freedom, Image Text, Black Care, and the Ethics of Seeing. I'll state, because you couldn't hear me, that I'm a professor of art history and visual culture, and my research explores the intersections of contemporary art, Africana philosophy, decolonial theory, post-colonial critique, and visual theory broadly. And so my notes will attempt to weave together several conceptual strands. The work of Roland Barthes, the visual legacies of Blackness and Black power in South Africa and America, and in particular, the ethical dimensions of what it means to see and be seen. So we begin with this deceptively simple question, which is, what does it mean to look after freedom? And I unfold the lecture in three parts. First, Barthes and the image-text relationship, also word. Number two is Black consciousness, visual culture, and decolonial critique in South Africa. And then the third has to do with some recent work, my book, The Visual Dynamics of Art, Black Care and Ethics in South African Art. This photograph is, I was with a colleague and friend, Jay Pather, at the Smithsonian Institution for one of his events. And there was a panel discussion. And afterwards, we took this photograph. The first thing Jay Pather said to me, he looked at me and he said, I'm surprised you didn't ask one of your obtuse questions. And I smiled and I looked at him and I shook my head no. I knew that there was a kind of expression of criticism, looking for analysis, looking for judgments of the merits and the faults of a work. As Sean brilliantly mentioned, if we unpack the conceptual terrain, which is the first part of what I'd like to do, I returned to the prompt. I got the prompt and I thought, 1973, Roland Barthes, what does that have to do with me? What does it have to do with the sorts of issues that I'm concerned with now? Which very quickly spun my brain into thinking about Diderot and this particular page from his encyclopedia, where there's memory, reason, and imagination. And under imagination, there's an attempt to categorize each sort of posy, narrative, dramatic, or something else that goes to allegory. So in the context of this talk, I want to begin with this deceptively simple question about what it means to look after freedom. And I'll emphasize this idea of the third meaning, which I understand as Barth's affective, elusive excess, that which escapes both denotation and connotation. The meaning becomes unstable, it becomes dispersed, it becomes performative. The viewer becomes a co-author thereby in the meaning-making process. Barthes says, and signals this, in signaling this post-structuralist turn, Barthes notes interpretation becomes a practice of tracing, but not stabilizing meaning. The introduction that wouldn't give you the audio talked about the Space for Creative Black Imagination, Inc. and a flagship project called the Juneteenth Institute. And as I was thinking about the intersection of literature and the visual, my mind was with Juneteenth and Ralph Ellison, the fragments of texts that were posthumously assembled by his editor and friend, pulling together what Ralph Ellison in 1970 is offering as a kind of presentation or introduction to Black folks in America. The idea of pulling together and assembling fragments is very important to Ellison in advance of Barth's obtuse meaning, the studium or the punctum, or semiotics, or even authorship, because in African or decolonial context, this takes a somewhat different tone. Some critics talk about Barthes as being fraught with misreadings or a kind of mythological celebrity. Mudileno critiques the limitations of Barthes' obtuse reading, saying that the semiotic focus on what the image signifies politically causes him to overlook the actual individual and the context. Even the idea of colonial history or racial repression is for some too easily set aside. Sean Michelle Smith points out that Barth's studium description is laden with a, quote, paternal racism, unquote, that is a condescending characterization of Black respectability. So there are a plethora, probably uncountable number of responses to Barth's obtuse meaning, critiques of Barth lacking social context or depoliticizing images. So one of the strongest critiques, of course, comes from Fred Moten in the break from, this was about 2 decades ago, talking about the aesthetics of the Black radical tradition. And then more recently, Stanley Wanambois in February 2022 reflects on Barth's probably most famous work, Camera Lucida. But for our purposes of unpacking this conceptual terrain, I want to pull a Barth's move, I think, and show this image that he calls graphic bliss. The caption says before painting music. This one is quite early, it's from 1939. And then I know I'm jumping around here, but to show you the kind of movements that I went through to try to understand or try to think through what this obtuse meaning, what impact this obtuse meaning has on us for the moment, for today. In doing so, I kept going back to, again, the year 1973. In South Africa, we note that the Black consciousness movement was led by Steve Biko, and in this moment, it's emphasizing psychological liberation as essential to political freedom. Influenced by the Black Power movement in the United States, it responded to apartheid's regime of erasure and control with a philosophy of affirmation and self-definition. If we note here some of the activities, I have some screenshots. 1972 from the Smithsonian offers this. And then in 1973, the New York Times reported on the dream, quote unquote, the dream, where Blacks are moving painfully toward full equity, which is the headline here. So Ralph Ellison's Juneteenth is offering us a literary response to some of these social and political movements. And of course, you may recall that 2023 marked the 50 years since the Durban strikes in 1973, where the striking workers from the textile mill in Durban impacted the broader society. In January 1973, the labor movement that unfolded in Durban marked a pivotal moment in the struggle against apartheid. Africa is a country, the journalistic website details how approximately 2,000 Black workers at the factory initiated a strike that demanded better wages, better working conditions. And it was this action that ignited a wave of strikes over the subsequent 2 months that involved upwards of 100,000 Black and Indian workers across factories and shops in Durban. We note that these strikes challenge the prevailing notion of a quote unquote quiet decade that follows the intense repression of anti-apartheid activities in the 1960s. The collective action of these workers demonstrates the potential power of organized labor in confronting systemic oppression. And the article emphasizes that the Durban strikes offer a catalyst for the resurgence of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, including the critical role of grassroots labor activism in the broader structure for freedom and equality. So part of the critique that comes in for Barthes has to do with the disavowal of the historical. Sean mentioned this in his talk, disavowal of the historical in photography and in the visual that reduces it to a field of merely quote unquote human interest. There's to a figuring of photographic historicality as overwhelmed by that kind of universal intentionality of the photographer. It can only ever result in a kind of general enthusiastic commitment without a kind of focus, without a special acuity. There's also in Barthes an ontological differentiation between photography and the photograph, and a semiotic neutralization of what's unorderable or what's non-meaningful, what is called the phonic substance of photography. I'll go back to Moten here to quote from page 204. It says, Barthes turns from the vulgar unere photography of the shout and toward the refined photography of the prick or the wound, which is tied to an ontological questioning that is founded on the unreproducibility of a photograph and the theological veiling of the original in the interest of a theory of photographic signification. And in the fundamental methodological move of what has been called enlightenment, we see the invocation of a silenced difference, a silent Black materiality, which is marshaled in order to justify a suppression of difference in the name of a false universality, end quote. So what are we to make of these kind of responses to the noem, or what Barthes calls the object of desire? This is the object of Barthes' analytic desire. Listening carefully to the muted sound of the photograph as it resonates in Barthes' text on the photograph, and through his repression and denigration of it, gives us some clues about the development in which egocentrism and ontologism, which are closely tied to each other in theory, offer a kind of epistemology of unalloyed looking. Moten asked the question, how do we attune ourselves to a moan or a shout that animates the photograph with the intentionality of the outside? Barthes is interested in, but by implication, does not love the world. I've considered this as I was pulling these threads together and thinking about it. I came back to this photograph from Romer Bearden from 1964, which is from the projection series called Mysteries. It comes with a bit of a digression and a story, but the story is that in analyzing this photograph, oh wow, longer ago than I'd like to admit, I was flummoxed by the scratches, the abrasions on the face of the central figure. I still haven't figured them out, but clearly they offer a kind of distress. They show up as the kind of cut that is not the montage or collage cut, but in fact a cut on the surface, on the skin of the face of the central figure here. This moment popped into mind, and very quickly later I remembered this. The Luggage is Still Labeled Blackness in South African Art was published in 2003, Julie McGee and Vuye. And we see on the cover this photograph from Temenkosi Ganiwe and Malcolm Payne, where there's a plaster, a Band-Aid, applied to the face. Now, in thinking of these associations that came to mind, I started thinking, well, what about this wound? What about this cut? How do we attend to that which wounds? And it's the ensemble of the social and the senses that are given in this encounter, this space-time encounter that's between encountering. In such this cut lies certain chances. The encounter is a cut that instantiates and where rhythm holds in music, if we follow Moten. And the suggestion is that there's a spatial temporal organization in which we might commit an action. Well, what sort of action is required to attend to the sorts of cut that Bearden offers us in 1964 is an open question. Another question has to do with the role of Black consciousness in relation to South African social life, but also ethical life. And so the third move that I'll attempt here is to offer an intervention and say that artworks are not static representations, but dynamic relations. 1991, Mika Ball makes this argument very strongly in her response to Barthes. And in fact, that reference to historical artworks' meaning for the present is important here. So the first intervention is that artworks are not static representations, but dynamic relations. Second is that Black care may emerge as an alternative to the violence of visibility under colonial modernity and perhaps for our present moment. And then the third is that visual culture becomes a site for ethical witnessing. What do I mean by that? Well, let me return to this chronological date of 1973 to try to fill it out. I understand that the audio will not work here, but if I play this, we see a discussion from Black leaders in 1973. The narrator of this special, a Black Journal special, I'll put on the caption so perhaps we can see some of what they're saying. We see an assembly of Black leaders who are trying to work out really what is possible for Black life in 1973. Again, between the Durban strikes and the activities in the United States, including this roundtable, I'm continually seeking to situate visual culture, not just for this moment of 1973 in a historical sense that it happened, but also what does it mean for our contemporary moment? Noting, of course, that criticism responds to the contemporary. There's no way for me to be in the past. There's no way for me to jump into the future, whether or not I'd like to. And in this way, it seems to me that contemporary artists, contemporary critics, the theoretical frameworks that we use, ought to respond with a kind of care. And in fact, I'm advancing a methodology of care. So artists like Zanele Mohole or Dineo Bopap are not just making new images, they're practicing care. They're acknowledging grief. They're charting new directions for social imagination. As I move towards a closing and into the third part of what I'd like to offer you today, I'd like to share this photograph from Roland Barthes on Roland Barthes. I was struck or punctured by his mother's ability to hold him at such a advanced age. And in reading Roland Barthes' Morning Diaries, I noticed that the attachment, this has been commented on extensively by others. I noticed how there's an attachment to the mother and this sense of melancholy, loss, and recovery, this idea or demand for love. And in looking at this from Barthes, of course, I turned to my own mother, who uh, was the one who provided my early caretaking. Just like all of us, our mothers bring us here and allow us to survive, at least until we can survive on our own. And in fact, what we learn from the ethics of care is that that may be enough to enter into a relation with the world. Um, the challenge then is to consider how practices of care in the visual world uh, stimulate or catalyze that relation. To see is to be implicated, to witness is to respond. And that may or may not offer a kind of engulfment. Barthes writes here that the crisis of engulfment can come from a wound, but also from a fusion. We die together from loving each other. It's an open death by dilution into the ether, a closed death of the shared grave. Um, and I love the meditation on death just a moment ago, but we're alive at this moment. And even if we are engulfed and hypnotized by the notion of dying, we're very much alive and living among each other. So in context, and in thinking about, well, what is this that brings us together, or what terms might we engage through the visual? I'd like to offer just a moment from very recently in the context of the United States and in honor of the transnational conversation. The way in which recent culture activity not only grounds the concepts, the aural, the words, and the performance of Kendrick Lamar, in this case at the Super Bowl, but also offers representational challenges for us. The signage of real lived realities, the voices of people who are impacted by the relations that we maintain. So I think I'll stop there. I'm at time, but I thank you for the opportunity to share these ideas with you.
Thank you so much, Rael. That's was a really fascinating bridge from Barth to the so-called quiet decade to your current research. So thank you for that. I'd like to sort of pick up on your discussion of Black care and in relation to looking. And I think afterwards I'd like to sort of bring this back to something Sean said as well. But Rael, I was wondering how perhaps you could say something a little bit more about how Black care inflects looking for the looker. How does one look caringly as a and how does Blackness change the way that we look, whether or not the looker is Black or white or identifies in some other way? How do we look caringly?
You're asking a big question, and I appreciate that. So the guiding question of the book is, how can art interpret our place in time, right? Interpretation looks for what's important And in doing that, it brings normative possibilities into view. And as it does that, it connects with ethics as a form of philosophical reflection of moral principles and practices. So if the character of a time or a culture or a place is considered an ethos, it's also thereby an interpretation. And it makes the interpretive function of an object that which enables the ethical function of art. So let me put it this way. We humans are continually being made and remade into new actors by all sorts of forces. What I may have presented in October of last year is different from what I might say in this setting in March. But as we're responding to our environment, we can ask, well, what role do the visual images play in presenting new possibilities, right? New practical possibilities, new conceptual possibilities, new virtual possibilities. And surely that's the role of art and the imagination, where other possibilities become available for feeling, for thinking, for moving through the world. And so the argument that I'm attempting to make is that we become ethically engaged with others as we look. And we are able to continue that sort of ethical engagement in response to the relationships that we appreciate or value or depreciate or devalue in our more contemporary moments.
Thank you. I just see we've had a question from the audience. I'm going to read it out. Perhaps, Sean, we could start with you in answering this. So art critic Roberta Smith said, art accumulates meaning through an extended collaborative act. You spoke of the role of the critic, even the decline. I'm curious about your thoughts on present-day participation and authorship in the art world. If many have a say through social media, how can one foster a critical dialogue? Is there still an expert? Does that dilute a type of power one used to have over the content? Okay, sorry, I pressed the wrong button, but I think, Sean, over to you.
I suppose power and authority are complicated words. With, I suppose, the idea of a distributed conversation, a more horizontalized one that people are proposing with criticism circa now, there may be a dilution of authority, but I suppose, there's been a flattening of commentary more generally, and a kind of broadening of participation, which is important. I think, in the talk, why I raised this idea of the figure of the pundit, and maybe kind of exaggerated the tradition of journalistic art criticism. There's many forms of art criticism. Journalism, I suppose, is one that's going through the greatest torsions in the present. And it has to do with I suppose, dispassion, in the sense that a journalist has to consistently report and produce a body of knowledge on a great diversity of artists. And arguably that art historians face that too. You can select certain artists to privilege, but it is that engagement with diversity, whereas I suppose punditry tends to lean into favoritism. And yeah, I'm suspicious of a knowledge that is purely an aggregation of millions of heart emojis, and that becomes the kind of that we cede power to that. And I suppose to again repeat, I think, and I know it from writing classes that I've given, when I begin always by asking the class to name art critics, because to be a participant in the field is also to read colleagues and to, I suppose, argue with them or invoke them. I mean, Rael's presentation invited a number of other voices in, and it's very clear he's reading in a very fine-tuned way, and they become expressions of your intellectual project. I suppose the figure of the art critic has become a caricature in some sense, and too narrowly associated with journalistic art criticism. And I think we also need to break that. And I think it was useful to invoke Roland Barthes. And one thing on Barthes, when he was, I think the correct word is his investiture as a professor, he said he felt like a charlatan because his métier was the essay, in which he said analysis, scientific analysis, vies with a literariness or style. And you have this sort of great opposition going on there, writing beautiful sentences that say nothing. I mean, that's often the accusation of certainly the belletristic tradition of art criticism, which the formalists rejected. And I'm rambling a bit, but I think we should widen the understanding of what art criticism is, because it also points to perhaps new voices. I really like Rael's proposition or question: what does it mean to look after freedom? And who's looking and writing after freedom? And it's a very critical question in South Africa.
Sorry, who do you think is looking and writing after freedom? I mean, if you were to take the temperature, maybe at a global level, and Sean, just coming back to, I mean, you characterize the origins of art criticism with the sort of 19th century bourgeois culture, at least Western art criticism. What is there such a thing as a kind of post-Western art criticism? Where are we, and how does this medium evolve? Can it evolve if we're thinking about a situated practice? Yeah.
I think if one thinks more basically of the artist as a proposition maker and putting a non-verbal thing into the world, and an audience engages with it, that engagement unavoidably skirts criticism. At its basic level, it produces maybe comment, and if it's engaged, imaginative, invested, not afraid, I think it aspires to being criticism. In South Africa, I could point to a number of young writers that are doing that, but they're doing it at a time of transformation where the kind of settled outlets in media and also financial support of it are falling away. And I think the kind of gig economy, which platform capitalism offers, is a very unreliable place to do it, because other motives and alibis enter it. I think we've pretty much closed the door on an extended period of criticism that reproduced itself, in the sense that there was a lineage of critics who not all necessarily agreed. They would argue amongst each other and have factions and schisms and breaks, but it happened within a very settled infrastructure, which would be print. And we've entered the era of digital publishing, but it's very messy, and it doesn't have the same financial support systems, And, I saw Robert Storr speak once, and he said, one thing that's often forgot about the infrastructure of publishing is the role of the editor and what that invisible presence provides to what is public-facing writing. And, particularly with the internet, that's fallen away. And so what you end up with is a lot of draft-based thinking or sort of dangling propositions, which particularly social media is good at.
Rael, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I appreciate it. I mean, knowing that Sean has been leading a generation of critics in South Africa, I take that I take the concern seriously, right? The idea that there are pressures beyond what one might want as a kind of well, Barthes wanted a kind of neutral, right? The neutrality of responding to sensorium in the world around us. I wonder what Sean thinks. I mean, Sean, I'll ask you what you think about as artists, as critics, right? Because it seems to me that artists, and particularly in contemporary art, it has the ability to provide certain new values, right? Making new values, creating new values. And in the process, I think touching on the ability of fictional narrative to make inventive contributions. And this is, I think, the line I'm following, that visual works can make inventive contributions to critical discourse, particularly as it matters to the ethics and politics of life. I mean, I don't want to say that new artworks necessarily involve a fictive creative dimension. I don't think that's the case. But if there are new forms that do respond and engage in meaningful ways, then it makes sense to point to that. I also want to go back to something about the value of I think the term was dispassion that was used. And I don't know about dispassion. Sean, you're laughing already. I wonder about the notion of dispassion in this context. I would love to talk more about that. Because there is this notion of, the Enlightenment notion of the Western tradition is that of abstract universal values. This idea that there can be a outside to these dialogues. And so there's a challenge there, which is that, if we approach it, if we think about the historical theoretical role that criticism plays, particularly in South African art, then I wonder, what is the artwork's interpretive role, and what is the critic's interpretive or ethical role, right? So, Sean, I just wonder what the notion is of in terms of the critic's role as as an engaged viewer.
I like the basic question about the role of the artist in this, because in looking at what I do, one unavoidably sort of rubs up against who did what before me. And I mentioned Ivor Powell in the talk. Ivor Powell was a very luminous art critic, particularly in the late 80s, going into the 90s. Journalistic, but wrote numerous catalog book essays. And he studied under the painter Robert Hodgins at the University of Witwatersrand. And Robert Hodgins is probably best known to South Africans for his sort of late post-retirement, let's say, neo-expressionist paintings. But Robert did about 10 years, almost a decade, as a jobbing art critic, because his initial career as a painter stumbled. And so he recognized the value of writing and wrote a very withering critique of Clement Greenberg when he came to South Africa. But Robert, in turn, was a sort of pupil, if you will, and a printer for Walter Barthes, who is also a kind of quasi-mythical figure in South African art, but was also a teacher. And one of the things he did was set up a journal at the University of South Africa, and himself was an art critic and writer, and far more well known for that before he, in his later career, had the sort of breakthrough as a painter figure. That's sort of one tradition where artists make the discourse and write from a place of deep investment and understanding. That's one. Another, John Copland's, interestingly, briefly taught before leaving South Africa. And one of his students was Peter Clark. And Peter Clark is a very important figure in the transition of Black modernism from a very particular sort of mid-century format into the present. And, you know, Peter Clark corresponded with Langston Hughes. Peter Clark won a short story competition. He even went to the Ohio Writers' Workshop. And in the very sort of immediate present, he encouraged Simpiwe Nzube to pursue his practice. And it's a very different version of care. I mean, Peter wrote poetry. He didn't indulge in criticism. But if you look at the total project of individuals like that, one recognizes something propulsive and that is palpable to other people. And I'll jump here in the sense that I was chatting to a young photographer who's really sort of making a name for himself at the moment, Lindo Kuchle Subekwe. And Lindo, his two heroes are Ernest Cole and Santu Mofokeng. And he told me of his first meeting with Santu Mofokeng because, much like photographers do, he took his portfolio of photographs to show Santu. And Santu said, "It's all good, but tell me, what are you reading?" And Lindo said, "Well, I'm not reading, I'm making photographs." And he said, "Well, come back when you can tell me what you're reading." And, you know, anyone that knows Santu would also know his own writing about his photography, which probably stands and is more durable than any commentary on him. It's not to dismiss or sort of the many accomplished critics who've written about him, you know, Corinne Disserens, Akwi Wizo, but there's a sort of strength in Santu's writing that has a adjacency. It's not merely a caption to his work. It's really invested in it. The dispassion, I agree with you. I mean, I studied as a lawyer, so I'm perhaps leaned too heavily into that. I'm implicated, and it's taken me many years to realize that being implicated in the system actually can be beneficial. And one should actively pursue that. I mean, you mentioned Fred Moten. He's such a huge jazz fan. And it was only when I made a terrible band with a painter friend that I suddenly recognized something very different and what the meaning of the word risk is, or vulnerability, in terms of practice, and how one needs to incorporate that into thinking about writing about what artists do.
Anthea, can I respond to that?
Of course, please. Sorry, go ahead. Please go ahead.
Sean, I appreciate it. I'm curious about this band of yours. That's a detail I didn't know. But, and I appreciate, you know, the reference to Mofokeng. I think about how crucial the text is in relation to those some of that work. But I also wanted to talk about the difference between looking and something else, right? So there's this I can't do anything but read this line, which is, it says, the look, a self-looking, requires another. The other is required to anchor a sense of self, to support not only a sense of subjectivity, but also relationality. Looking is more than simply observation, and it is probably more affective than it is aesthetic. Looking is different from opticality, the use of our physical eyes and the sense of observation, whereas the physical and cognitive operation is only the first step. And I'm going to that, and I wanted to read it to get it right, because Nicholas Mirzoeff teaches us that there's, and he refers to Barthes actually as he's talking about this. He's talking about the lover's discourse in particular. The look that involves recognition, acknowledgement, and gratitude. And I pick up on that because, you know, as Mirzoeff is charting this history of visuality, again and again, we think about it as an active process. I mean, it's that it demonstrates the authority of the visualizer. And so I guess the phrase that can encapsulate this is the syncretic relation. You know, each looker invents the other. And, you know, of course, for someone like Edward Glissant, thinking about the poetics of relation, for Glissant, looking is giving on and with. So that, you know, looking is as complex in such a way that it simply cannot be reduced, at least for Glissant. So I think what I want to kind of emphasize or highlight or underline is the activity of invention and imagination that comes with the looking. In my view, it's a dynamic and kind of fantastic sort of looking that happens. And I think that's what allows us to establish what's right in ethical relationships, right? So I respond strongly to what you're saying, Sean, about, you know, it requires a kind of risk. It requires a vulnerability. It requires a willingness to jump in a certain way, but also without dismissing or somehow neglecting the complexity of the entwinement between art and ethics, the complexity of artists who are taking risks to offer something about the world around us happening now, but also critics who are taking risks in saying something about what they see in the work these artists are doing in very active ways.
Very interesting. We just have another question from the audience, if I can interject with that. Franco Bifo-Baradi describes our online interactions as a form of cognitive capitalism. Perhaps the example of art critic to influencer, instead of going back to what has been in this field, how can integrity in art journalism counteract this form of looking to join an emoji community? I don't understand the last part of the question, but my understanding here is that the question is about, you know, what now? Where do we go? Where do we go from here, for want of a better way of putting it? I guess I think the use of the word integrity is very interesting, and I think it relates to, sorry, I'm sort of jumping in here a little bit, but I think the word integrity is really interesting, and it relates to a sort of ethics of care and an ethics of truthfulness, to the extent that one can be truthful, or at least honesty. But perhaps I should leave that question in your capable hands, both of you.
Rael, do you want to go first?
I was going to give that to you. I'm gonna, Jean, let's hear from you, because it's specific to criticism, and so if I can take the license, because I have a microphone, to ask, you know, how do you think about honesty in what you're doing?
How do I think about honesty?
in your practice of criticism, because in reading it, I find it to be I imagine some of your comments to be vulnerable making. But in some ways, your integrity as a critic says, okay, I'm going to write it and print it anyway. How do you negotiate that?
Wow, these are tough questions. In the main, the practice of criticism is very prosaic, which is not to say banal or that it doesn't have value, but there's a certain procedural element that slips in. And this is because the figure of the art critic often gets lionized. But, if we can pick many and, from, let's say, John Berger to Maurice Berger, their writing or their names achieved a currency because they were associated with certain titles. And that's the infrastructure that I'm talking about. And that is at the moment in a state of flux. You can't decide, I think, I'm going to be a metropolitan art critic a la Baudelaire and flaneur about and build an audience. That's sure, that is partly what is happening online, but I think penetrating, honest, risky criticism requires patronage. And what that patronage is in 2025 is very diffuse and diverse. I think the Academy has become a sponsor, a patron, and it produces, its outputs appear in a certain form. Traditional legacy media is under threat, so it is trying to compete with the social media sphere, and it creates a certain type of writing. But if I step back, much of this research wasn't, I said this came out of a failed PhD. My doctorate was actually looking at the writings, the collected writings of a fiction author from South Africa, Ivan Vladislavich, who in many ways is the heir to J.M. Coetzee, maybe not stylistically, but in a certain tradition. But Ivan's writing is deeply engaged with visual culture, yet it, in the main, expresses itself in fiction. And I'm very enthused and encouraged by the risk that proposes. But there's no truth built into it, which is also something I liked. For a while, I had a rubric for sort of tackling this topic. And the rubric was unreliable truths. And sort of working in that space to try speak more openly, imaginatively, provocatively about things that are in the real. With Ivan, for example, one of the thematics of his work is the brick and the wall, which is so much a social facet of South African life. Anyone that visits would know that it's a walled off suburbia. Walls go up everywhere. And I only recognized that reading Ivan's literature and extrapolated it to, oh my gosh, there's a constellation of artists that are occupied with walls that you wouldn't necessarily obviously connect either through media or just social relations or whatever. And it took, I suppose, putting aside a kind of commitment to facts to a kind of formalist criticism and looking obliquely and recognizing that there's a possibility in that space for thinking about, and I go back here, what does it mean to look after freedom? And how do you narrate that freedom? And perhaps that fiction space or that ambiguous space of the essay where everything's contingent and you can use the words perhaps and maybe the whole time, has agency. I mean, that's perhaps where I'm most closely betrothed to. It's the tradition of art critics that I've loved and valued the most. So I'm surprised that I was arguing about dispassion. But I've come to recognize its value too.
I appreciate that. And as I was listening, I think this is the first and only moment that I've had to recognize Colin Richards in thinking about my thought on criticism in the context of South Africa and Colin Richards' insistence on humanism as a baseline or as a place to go when we're wondering about honesty or truthfulness. And I was also thinking about method, because as far as I can tell, the South African art historical practice has been concerned with categorizing, right? Classifying, understanding where the art fits within a scheme from the past, right? And I think maybe this is an important point for me to say out loud. My argument is that the art is intellectually interesting, not only when we can find a tidy place for it within existing schemes, but because the visual practices exceed conceptual models. They exceed the frameworks that are ready to hand for talking about, for putting into words what's going on. And I think following Mirzoff and Mitchell and Ball and Moten and a host of other thinkers of the visual, that there are ways in which the art itself elucidates the murky approaches. So in a certain way, my sense is that some recent art, not all, and not necessarily, some recent art takes the problem or the problem of life in South Africa as a philosophical problem, right? So the visual phenomena itself, the artistic practice itself throws into question how does the past influence our present, right? I'm thinking about the question as it kind of jumbles around in here. The question was about, the current critics and how to engage with integrity. I think rather than trying to get a pinpoint answer to that, my sense is that visual practices that are concerned with the practice of freedom actually throw the past into question. It's actually a critical approach to historicizing or making sense of what was before.
Good point. I mean, also if I think, just listening to you, I immediately thought of two artists, young artists, one who's very much visible in the global north, Nolan Oswald Dennis, and a younger artist who's collaborated with him, Vusi Nkomo. But interestingly, I mean, you can track a parallel output of writing. And I think maybe it's a bit formalist, but criticism needs to express itself in a way that leaves a trace. We don't remember good conversationalists from a cafe. They only live in one generation's memory. And I think both these artists, Vusi's written a lot of exhibition reviews. Nolan has produced a lot of, let's say, paratextual work that both speaks to his work, but speaks to a kind of post-digital reality, but as it's emerging on the African continent. And they're very dynamic, those texts read in relation to what those artists specifically are doing, but I think also more broadly an emergent grouping or constellation of young artists working 30 years after, let's say, the detente of 1994. There's various interpretations of what 94 represent, but and I don't say that cynically. I'm just I think we must criticize and all those moments and reread them.
Hi, sorry. I wonder if I may be as bold to ask a question or make a prompt here from my side. I've listened with great interest here from the side, and I'm very keen to keep on listening. But some things just appeared in my own head that, I think they're more prompt for responses, perhaps from you, or however you feel. And it's really for both of you, because there's a way in which I see these things running together in my own particular strange mind. So if you don't mind, I just want to kind of go through some of these things that I wrote down as I was listening. And one of the things about Barthes and notions of the death of the author, and even in this case, I think as Rael has shown, is this question of the excess as in some way occupying a strange kind of, I want to call it a non-material position, a non-particularity, if you like, a kind of a universalism. But that is, for me, exactly the point of this kind of notion of care that Rael was speaking about. Because for me, the kind of excess, that I'm looking for is a kind of excess that has to do with poetry, something beyond the linguistic, as deriving from the real lived experience and forms of self-expression, And I'm sorry, these are thoughts that just kind of jumble. But then on that level, we have this notion again then of saying the novel is kaput or art criticism is kaput, which of course Salman Rushdie has written about in great humor and great length in his own particular way. Sean then answers this by the notion of Eagleton's juridical technology and so on. But of course, the great American writer who had his fair share of critiques and so on, Dave Hickey, he saw it as this kind of notion of art criticism in its present form as very much arriving on the scene to service a new kind of institutional shift in patronage from blue blood to new money, so to speak, and perhaps today, as Sean rightly pointed out, from both blood and money to sweat. But I think what's interesting is, of course, Santam of King's own writings and his own larger projects like the Black Photo album, in some way they're institutionally located within the University of Pretoria, strangely enough, with Professor van Onselen and so on. And from that kind of practice. So this question of patronage is real, but the question of care that accompanies this question of institutionality and patronage and material particularity seems to me to be interesting, because later on, then I'm thinking about the things that Rael said about the ethics of seeing, the ethics of care. I mean, who cares about images and why do they care? We know institutions care, for example. But when we talk about the material particularity of the things, as Rael showed in relation to black bodies and care as a methodology, if you like, then I think that there is no pretense towards this kind of universality, but instead towards the particularity. And you spoke about Bearden's photo collage there, the scratches, the abrasions as distress. But interesting for me with regards to Santu, and this is how things are jumping around my head as I'm listening to you, and I guess the real reason why I'm making all these comments is because I care about the things you say, which I think is particular and strange, and it moves me to respond. But the interesting thing for me is that I had a lot of time to think about Mofokeng's own practice and his use of almost haptic forms of seeing, scratches, noise in photography. And I think for me, what's interesting about that thing is I'm not reading it as a kind of damage, but an invocation, if you like, towards another form of caring that is not visually located, that is perhaps haptic, sensorial, bodily, particular in this moment, and away from the kind of institutional forms of care that have become the kind of hallmarks of today's art criticism or ideology punditry, as Sean called it, and so on. So I'm going to stop there because I think there's that call about particularity that I like and caring, not necessarily always kind of motivated by institutional prerogatives and so on, which perhaps obviously always also finds a home in very particular artist practice. So I'm just putting them out there, and I guess it's an invitation to comment from your side. But thank you very much. I found it fascinating. Really great points.
Thank you for your question. I'll jump in just on the note about the particularity and my mention of the figure in the center of having these abrasions. The abrasions are there. I added this notion of recuperation, right? I added this notion of a kind. I made a suggestion that those abrasions, which may have come from photocopies, right, or may have come from the process of photomontage, gives us a reference to physical recovery or physical recuperation. And my sense is in doing that, I would like to think of it as an intervention, right? In the way that Bearden offers an intervention, a break, a reassembly. The way that Ellison in Juneteenth offers these fragments to an editor that posthumously assembles them and entitles it Juneteenth, which in the American context has a specific historical resonance. And so my sense is that I should say that the way we categorize or the way we classify what's happening in words, to go back to your prompt, Johan, what is the word here, right? Has to do with the constitutive element that is involved in looking, the negotiation in looking, the relational element of it. I think of it as social, I think of it as cultural, I think of it as political, I think of it as even cosmic even. All of that considered together offers a kind of philosophy of being, the philosophy of possibility. And I kind of moved too quickly past this notion of the sonic, and I don't know that I will satisfy anyone with this reference, but Tina Camp, in Listening to Images, talks about how listening became a metaphor, and then it became more complex and more concrete, and thinking about frequency as sonic and visual in terms of light waves and how they register, and the haptic moves us, right? It's the way the forms affect our relationships to one another. So for Kant, that's not metaphorical. It's actually, in a certain sense, what's happening now as we're in conversation. In a certain way, it matters to the notions of clear classification. And if there is something that is shared or common, I'll go back to it. It's that something I've learned from reading in care ethics is that it starts with this sense that we wouldn't be here if we weren't cared for when we were born. We were all cared for at the moment of our arriving in these forms. And so that if that is the least of the commonality that we can address, then that is where we start as as a way of reminding us of the relationality or the interconnection among things. So I appreciate the question. It was a complex question, and so I would add that the prompt made me think about Barthes. Barthes made me think, what do I have to do with Barthes? 1973 was a chronological marker I could kind of go to and think with. I went to 1973 and started thinking, well, what are the conditions of the world in 1973? Because I'm not there now. And so what of this intermingles with the kinds of concerns that may be more recent and more pressing? And in the context of you know, the pressures of society, I'll put it that way, the pressures of society and the entanglements of discourse of freedom or liberty or democracy, I thought, if nothing else, I could say something about how fraught our engagements with others are in this moment.
Yeah, if I could shift things entirely, there's an exhibition that opened at the Centre Pompidou, Paris Noir, and one of the paintings included on there is by the brilliant Buford Delaney, but it's particularly a portrait of James Baldwin, who, if one reads about Baldwin, he said his first credible model of an artist and the possibility for himself of being in the world was Buford Delaney. And, you know, Buford ended up being buried in a pauper's grave at the end of his journey. But I mean, I'm a user of Instagram. I know some of you there are too. And what I find fascinating is the figure of James Baldwin as a kind of public intellectual of striking endurance. And on one level, one could call him a cultural critic, but that's to reduce him. I mean, where am I going with this? I mean, I think you've invoked Fred Moten, who can write some pretty abstruse, obtuse words, but is also read widely. And I'm interested in this thing of, you know, not defending art criticism or mourning its changes, but just its potential and its capacity to participate in contemporary cultural debate, as opposed to just being a discrete minor entry at the back of the paper that's functionally a notice about something. And I do worry that the hijack of criticism or its confusion with essentially digital punditry loses that radical potential. So where's the question in there? Let me be cheap. Would James Baldwin be on social media?
I think that's a great send-off question. I'm afraid we're out of time. I've thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you, Rael. Thank you, Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts, and Simonetta and Johan for hosting us. And thank you to everyone who joined. Just one small question of housekeeping. Sorry, Simonetta, I've just had a question about whether there will be a transcript available. I know there'll be a recording available, but...
There will be a recording, and I believe that everybody who signed up for the webinar will receive the recording. And
okay.
Assuming everyone agrees here, we will also post it on our YouTube channel. So it will be visible in the future together with the other symposia we had with our friends. So I want to just say thank you so much for this conversation, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And I had also so many questions and links that I drew from your talks, and I think it works so beautifully. And if you may allow me to sort of end with this thought that since we are, as IDSVA, committed to the nurturing of the artist philosopher, perhaps, you know, there is a place here where this third space may be in fact occupied by a new figure of artist who is in fact also able to invent new ways of critiquing, thinking, making art, right? And I know this will open another conversation, but perhaps we can leave it at that. And thank you for stimulating these thoughts.
I should very much like to thank you, to say thank you to everyone who participated tonight. Thank you so much to our speakers for the great care you have taken to prepare your presentations and your thoughts and so on, and for the care that infuses us with, in turn, to rethink our own relationships with the world and artistic practice, critical thinking, and so forth, in our own bodies as well. And then thank you very, very much to Simonetta and our colleagues from WITS, our colleagues from the University of Pretoria, for their continued efforts to keep these conversations alive. We very much appreciate it. And lastly, of course, thank you to our audience. Without you, this is a conversation that happens nearly behind closed doors. We know the webinar format has its limitations, but we are absolutely thrilled at the capacity to have such conversations, which just a few years ago would have been nearly impossible. So thank you for attending it and giving us your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Johan.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthea, Sean, Rael. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.